I'd like you to picture the scene, because it's a lovely one. It's early morning, and there's a beach by the shores of Lake Galilee. And on the beach is a charcoal fire, upon which is cooking freshly caught fish and bread. And Jesus is there. And Jesus invites his friends to come and eat breakfast. It's a lovely picture. And that invitation is there for each of us. Jesus invites us to come and find the nourishment and the strength that we need for the week ahead in his presence. I think this is one of the loveliest of the resurrection stories. There's something wonderful about it. Even, I suspect that there's something more going on here. As if this was a glimpse of something greater even than this. It's as if there's a glimpse here of eternity. Think about it. Creation, beautiful. A meal with old friends. The presence of the risen Christ. Can you see there's a glimpse of that which we look forward to? And one day we will experience something very similar to this. When times are hard, this is something to look forward to. We're here at the end of the great story, at the end of John's wonderful gospel. But there is one thread still to tie up. I don't know if you can remember what it is, but it's all about Peter. Peter was, of course, the leader of the disciples. Certainly he was the one with the biggest mouth. He was often outspoken, perhaps proud. I would have said bold and courageous, but actually, if you remember his last few days, not so much as he thought. And I think he had a real sense that he had particularly failed as a disciple of Jesus. It's interesting, I don't know that he had failed any more than any of the others. They'd all fled. They'd all hidden. But there was something about his pride. Remember, he'd said to Jesus, I will follow you even if it is to death. There's something about the pride of that statement which makes his failure all the worst. And he felt, I think, terrible shame as if he'd betrayed Jesus himself. And I don't know if you spotted, but isn't it interesting that he is fishing again? I thought he'd left that behind. When Jesus said, come and follow me, what he left behind was his fishing. In his failure, he's gone back to the one thing that he thought he was ever very good at. Although ironically, it turns out he's not even very good at that. And so here he is, eating breakfast. And I sort of imagine him not making eye contact with Jesus, struggling to look Jesus in the face because he doesn't know what to say. There are no words. He's so keen to be with Jesus, and yet he doesn't have the words to speak. And so eventually, after the meal, Jesus looks at him and says, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Now that's a really interesting question. I don't know what Peter was expecting. I don't know what you would expect in circumstances like this. Perhaps a stern rebuke or a final warning from Jesus if you ever do that again. But that's not what he gets at all. What Jesus requires of Peter is love. And that's the same thing that God requires of all of us. The problem, isn't that what Peter has done is so awful that it can't be forgiven. Very few things are. It's that he can't forgive himself. His pride has got in the way, and I suspect we all recognize something of that. That tendency to stand at a distance from God, unable to ask for forgiveness. Shame and pride are a deadly cocktail. And there are many people who stand at a distance from God their whole lives. We live with the guilt of the things that we've done wrong. We remember the ways that we fall short or have let Jesus down. But you know this. When you actually think about it, you know this. There's no good enough. None of us are good enough. A community like this is a community of forgiven sinners. That's all we ever are. What Jesus asks of us is not, are you good enough, but do you love me? Did you spot that Jesus actually says to Peter, do you love me more than these? I wasn't sure what he was referring to. Was it the fishing gear? No, it's the other disciples. Do you love me more than the rest of them? And that's an interesting question. Why do you think Jesus asked that of Peter? I suspect the answer is because of the job that Peter's going to do. Peter is going to be the leader of the early church. And when Jesus reinstates him, I don't know if you remember his name, Peter comes from the word for rock. And Jesus says, upon this rock, I will build my church. Now, Peter hasn't behaved much like a rock recently, but what Jesus requires of him is not necessarily his obedience or his steadfastness, first and foremost. It's his love. And when he says, do you love me more than these? It's because Peter is required to love more than these. His qualification for the job that he will do is not his courage or his boldness. It is his great love. Those who would lead in the church must love most deeply. I've been involved in discerning vocations to church ministry for many years, and it's a fascinating and rewarding thing to do. I've seen lots of young leaders come through to get ordained. An amazing thing to do, but I suspect that we don't ask that question enough. You know, what makes a great Christian leader? Is it that they are intelligent and erudite? Sure, those are really good things. Is it that they're creative and compassionate, able to articulate the gospel in a compelling way? Yes, those things are really important. But in actual fact, the thing that Jesus asks of Peter is the same thing he asks of us. It is great love. Or equally, what's the goal of the Christian life? What are you striving for? What does the Lord require of you? It's the same answer. Love is the greatest thing. Nat King Cole put it beautifully. The greatest thing you will ever learn is simply to love and be loved in return. I suspect the truth is we rather take the idea of love for granted. And I think Peter does exactly that. His response to Jesus, to that question that he was asked is, you know that I do. You can almost see the shrug in his shoulders, can't you? Sure. As if it wasn't the most important thing. And I think we have a real tendency to take love for granted. We shouldn't. We are most aware of love when it is lacking. And when you see churches which are torn apart, or leaders who fall because of something or other, it's always at the heart of it a lack of real selfless love. Love is the most important thing in a community like this. Never take it for granted. Celebrate it when you see it. Be grateful for it and pray for it when it fails. What hurts Peter the most is that Jesus asks him 3 times. I mean, it must have been quite uncomfortable. Do you love me? Sure. No. Do you love me? Yes, I do. The 3rd time Jesus asked him, Peter was really offended. Why did Jesus ask him 3 times? Well, I'm not sure that it's because Jesus doubts it, but that those 3 questions mirror 3 other things. And can you remember what the 3 other things were? Peter's denial. Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times, now has 3 times to reiterate his love for Jesus. But it's an interesting thing that Jesus does that, because it must have been really uncomfortable for Peter. You know, my tendency, and I suspect yours, is particularly with somebody that we love, is that we overlook their faults. We want to sort of brush them over a little bit, and we hope that they will do the same with ours. We just think that's nice. That's the sort of polite thing to do. Jesus doesn't really do that. You know the saying that love covers a multitude of sins? It doesn't mean that it kind of hides them. It means that it's big enough to cope with them. And Jesus looks rather directly at Peter's failings. And the truth is, he does the same at ours. And we don't need to be afraid of that, because love is big enough to cope with that. But if we are going to grow and be transformed and be set free from the things which enslave us, we actually need to be prepared to look rather more directly at our failings and our faults. Jesus looks directly at Peter's most painful moment and acknowledges it and recognizes it and then forgives it. Jesus' question is, do you love me? How are you with that question? Because I know it's not always an easy one. What if you're not really at the stage where you can say with any confidence that you do love Jesus? I definitely can relate to that. I can look at a stage in my Christian life where I might have said, well, listen, I've got great respect for Jesus. I think he's fantastic. I think he's one of the greatest human beings, the greatest human being that ever lived. You know what I mean? A sort of intellectual appreciation, but love was not something that came easily to me. If that's how you're feeling right now, well, there's some consolation, because Peter actually feels the same way. You wouldn't see this, but there's a very interesting dynamic going on here, which has a whole sermon in itself. But when Jesus says, Peter, do you love me? He uses one word for love. It's the agape word, which means sort of selfless, wholehearted, pure love. And when Peter replies, you know that I love you, he uses a different word. He uses philo, which is about kind of brotherly love. It's almost as if there's a kind of emotional immaturity in Peter, which isn't quite able to express wholehearted love in the way that he would like. So Peter is struggling with the idea of expressing his love for Jesus too. Don't be too worried about that. If this is the case for Peter, after 3 years of walking in Jesus' company, don't be surprised if your experience of love is slow to come to birth. But it's important. And the Holy Spirit is blowing on those glowing embers. And your prayer should be that that spark should turn into a flame. Because love is something that we learn, as Nat King Cole said, the greatest thing that we will ever learn. So that is the story of Peter's restoration and his forgiveness and his return. And it sort of ties up the end of the gospel story. That's where we are now. There's a couple more details that I'd just like to pull out, if you don't mind. And that's this. The first is that with Peter's restoration comes a commission. He has this new job. And Jesus says to him, feed my lambs, or feed my sheep. And I think it's such a lovely thing, such an important thing. I want to hold on to it because it's the foundation of Peter's ministry. And it's the foundation of all of our ministry, all of those who are involved in church leadership. That the job of caring for the people of God, of leading people to green pastures and still waters that restore their souls, that's it. That's the thing that we do. Ministry can seem quite overwhelming. But if that's what it is, well, okay, I think I can cope with that. It can seem very difficult, but it is actually that simple. And the tendency is to think that that's not enough. But that's what Jesus commissions Peter to do. Second observation, they are not Peter's sheep. Peter is the head of the church. He's a really important figure in the early church. But Jesus says, feed my sheep. That the people of God are Jesus' people. That Jesus is the good shepherd, the one who leads us. Leaders in the church don't even do the feeding. That there's a real tendency, I think, when you've found a church leader or a teacher who is really good, to think that it's them who was doing the feeding. It's not. All that a good church leader will ever do is lead you to the places where you can be fed. They'll lead you to Jesus himself. And in preaching the word, or in administering the sacraments, or leading us in prayer, what we're doing is we're leading one another to the presence of Christ, where we can be nourished and fed. And then finally, the way of Christ is costly. Did you spot that little bit at the end of the reading, where you got a picture of the end of Peter's life? Because he, like almost all of the disciples, would ultimately be martyred for his obedience to Jesus. In fact, there's an irony, because it turns out that he was right when he said, "Jesus, I will follow you even if it's to death." That's exactly what happens. We believe that it was in Rome that he was taken and eventually killed for his faith. And it's a strange thing to live with. Imagine Jesus saying that to you. But strangely enough, for Peter, it's somehow really quite a liberating experience. That are having to let go of the illusion of being in control of his life enabled him to live joyfully and with freedom and to be faithful even to the very end. Jesus says to him, you don't get to be in control of your life. Even in the darkest times, all that you need to do is to follow me. So that is the story. That is John's gospel. It's just a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful work of art, an inspired account of the events which changed the world. And it's full of the promise of Easter. And I suppose I just want to end with that same question that Jesus ends with. Jesus says to each of us, do you love me? And if you do, then follow me. Because if you have love, you need nothing else. Love is the answer to our fears and our failures. And that invitation stands for you day by day. Jesus, who invites you to come first thing in the morning and have breakfast with him. Find nourishment for your souls. Find the peace and all that you need to sustain you through the day. And if you will live that out day by day, you will catch those little glimpses of eternity, of the new creation, of that meal with old friends, and the never-failing presence of the risen Christ. And so here, as we stand at the end of the Easter story, may the Spirit of God stir up that same love in your hearts. And may your greatness in this world be your great love for God and for others. May the legacy that you leave be a legacy of love. Amen.